For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu.
When you get into the real inner self of the true baseball fan, it's even more profound in my view, because with baseball, you withdraw into this game for 2 or 3 hours, and if you're watching it intensely, then you are in this kind of sacred time. Well, that's a way of saying, when we get to playoff baseball, everything moves from black and white to technicolor. There's a greater intensity to it. That, of course, is a quality of sacred time, of kairos time, that there's an intensity to it. Now, where does that intensity come from? Because you're noticing, your biology is noticing things that you wouldn't ordinarily notice, especially in the blistering pace of modernity. With the hyper-stimulated environment in which most of us live our ordinary lives, Chronos and Kairos time, it can be summarized in one word, and that is the word liturgy. You're moving into liturgical time, and with liturgical time comes a whole set of experiences that are characterized by difference. Another way of saying Chronos and Kairos is to say ordinary and extraordinary, or profane and sacred.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. For a while when I was 9 years old, I had an early morning monastic ritual. School day or weekend, I was up before dawn, watching a VHS taped, edited for TV version of the baseball film classic, Field of Dreams.
If you build it, he will come.
I can still quote large portions of it to this day, and every now and then I just can't help but watch a few scenes. Based on the 1982 novel Shoeless Joe by W.P. Kinsella, it was adapted in 1989 and starred Kevin Costner and James Earl Jones, who died earlier this year. The film's about Ray, a Berkeley grad turned Iowa farmer who hears a voice and plows his acres of corn into a baseball field. He's somewhere between a figure of Noah building the ark, Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith, and a symbol of every kid who dreams of baseball, just longing to play catch.
Hey, Dad? You want to have a catch?
And as a kid, I just loved the movie. Maybe it wasn't anything more than the fact that I was just born and raised a baseball fan. Or maybe it's the film's gesturing toward something more.
Ease his pain. Ease his pain? What the hell does that mean, ease his pain?
Maybe it's the magical realism of it. Maybe it's the hero's journey.
Go the distance.
But something about it captured my 9-year-old mind.
The one constant through all the years, Ray, has been baseball.
That's James Earl Jones' monologue as Terrence Mann.
America has rolled by like an army of steamrollers. It's been erased like a blackboard, rebuilt and erased again. But baseball has marked the time. This field, this game, is a part of our past, Ray. It reminds us of all that once was good, and it could be again.
Somehow, baseball was more than a sport, more than a pastime, and more than a ridiculously strange game of confusing rules with all sorts of inexplicable exceptions carried out slowly over an extremely long period of time. I love it. It's ineffable. It can't be summed up in words. It's hierophantic, a strange manifestation of the sacred in everyday life. It shares in the eternal or infinite. With no game clock, baseball can technically go on forever. Every pitch is a new opportunity, the world reborn with possibility. And it's nostalgic, literally a homesickness. It's built around a harrowing odyssey of the batter, leaving home, circling the bases counterclockwise, and a longing struggle to return home. Those 4 words, ineffable, hierophantic, nostalgic, infinite, That's your vocab homework, and these are the driving concepts behind today's episode on baseball as a road to God.
I have confronted better than you, Evan. I've confronted better than you.
That's fine. That's fine. And that's my guest and unlikely friend, John Sexton. He's the president emeritus of New York University, where he's still the Benjamin F. Butler Professor of Law. Born and bred as a Brooklyn Catholic, he's an unlikely friend because he's a Yankee fan. And I was born outside of Boston into what was, at the time, a hopeless curse of Red Sox fandom. And yes, I wore my Red Sox hat to the interview just to mess with him.
You just told me that this is a highly volitional act on your part.
It is highly volitional.
Which was meant solely to stoke controversy. This is like the Russians interfering with the election.
Living in New Haven, we're right on the dividing line between Yankees and Red Sox fans. So it's a regularity at the local Little League where I'm very involved.
To be clear, I mean, again, you revealed a kind of vile part of your essence here because you live on the dividing line.
I invite you to find your nearest Yankees paraphernalia and get it in the camera.
All right, hold on just a second.
Thank you. There it is. There it is. This is perfect now. This couldn't be better from my perspective.
Okay.
But by the end of our conversation, he had invited me to join him at one of the final Boston-New York games of the season at Yankee Stadium. And in true fashion, the Red Sox lost after a come-from-behind Aaron Judge grand slam. But if you're looking for photographic proof that Red Sox and Yankee fans can coexist, can bridge partisan divides to become friends, you can check the episode page linked in the show notes. For 2 decades and throughout his college presidency, John has taught a special course at New York University, Baseball as a Road to God, exploring the ineffability, hierophany, nostalgia, and eternity of human and divine life through history, literature, stories, statistics, spectating, and just playing baseball. In 2013, he authored a best-selling book of the same name, Baseball as a Road to God, with Thomas Oliphant and Peter Schwartz. And in this episode, we discuss just an inning's worth of what baseball means at personal, communal, cultural, moral, and spiritual levels. Thanks for listening, friends. Play ball.
To be clear, I mean, again, you revealed a kind of vile part of your essence here because you live on the dividing line. There is in the wonder, the intellectual wonder of the coherence of Catholic theology. If you have 2 centuries to think something out, the one thing is true, and that is a lot of really smart people. Thomas Aquinas was smart.
Yeah.
And a lot of smart people end up thinking out the doctrinal structure. And it's wonderful when you step out of that structure, if you know it well, to see how well thought out it is once you accept the major premises, the major axioms of the system. It's like Euclidean geometry.
Sure.
And of course, a big issue for theologians down the ages is how do you treat the existence of self-evidently good people who are not part of the church, capital T, capital C.
Uh-huh.
And can they, in fact, be saved and not saved? And what status do they get in the kind of Dante's tripartite world? And so you end up, even with a very conservative Pope Pius XII, right, writing an encyclical called Mystici Corporis, in which he speaks of the church visible.
Yeah.
People like me who self-evidently have the gift of sanctifying grace, which just comes. You don't earn it. It comes by virtue of baptism. Of course, we have the opportunity to be saved, whereas a heathen like you, Evan, who does not have sanctifying grace, doesn't have the same opportunity we do. Now, then you get to those good people, and arguably, until we had some time together here, I thought of you as potentially being among those good people. As now I'm discovering these vile qualities that you have, but you don't have the excuse, because you grew up in New Haven, of being among quote, the invincibly ignorant, close quote. Those who don't have the opportunity to embrace the true faith. You're right there.
Except part of my baseball story really is where I did grow up. I was born outside of Boston. And when I was 6, my folks moved us to San Diego. So I grew up in the 90s when it was not popular to be a Red Sox fan as a diehard Red Sox fan in San Diego. And no one else rooted for the Red Sox. And I grew up going to Padres games and loving Tony Gwynn. But to your point, Red Sox fans have been through purgatory and have come out the other side.
No, that's not true at all. The Red Sox fans invented their victimization in the sense when Shaughnessy wrote the column on the curse. It was made up post facto, 50 years after the alleged curse act by a and of course I have to say, because my wife's family's from Boston, as is my beloved brother-in-law.
Good.
I'm obviously being satirical and facetious here.
I know.
But the way I tell this in the narrative is that the Red Sox fans appropriated the language of victimization.
Yeah.
For example, the good people of Brooklyn really earned, that we seem to be cursed. But how did we respond, the good people of Brooklyn? With one of the great virtues, the virtue of hope. Wait till next year. Wait till next year. Never
Absolutely.
lost hope. Or you take the people of Chicago who suffered for a century.
Yeah.
Right. But, they come from a city that calls itself the second city, recognizing the primacy of New York City.
Totally.
And, so how did they respond? They responded with resignation. The great T-shirts, what did Christ say to the Cubs as he rose into heaven? And the answer is, don't do anything till I get back. and then the other great T-shirt, which is, anybody can have a bad century. Shaughnessy writes this column in the 70s, in the face of such virtue. And it's a self-pitying, solipsistic, wallowing curse and damnation, by a people who just, responded with 25 cabs. There was no community.
I do appreciate the point that you make in the book. There was no curse. You just sucked for 85 years.
Right. And by contrast, the people of Philadelphia, who also had a bad century, they never used the word curse. There was no curse. They just said, we got lousy teams.
But it's fascinating how that curse language gets to very quickly, and I think it's fitting to start here, it gets your point about the proximity, the analogy between baseball and religion or spirituality or maybe magic.
There is this notion of whether you call it the chosen, and how do you deal with the chosen in an ecumenical world, whether it's Catholics claiming, as I was taught in the 1950s by a man named Daniel Berrigan, who was the Martin Luther King of the peace movement.
Amazing.
And Danny Berrigan, about a decade before he became the leader of the peace movement, or one of the leaders of the peace movement, wrote 4 Latin words on a blackboard in a Jesuit high school in Brooklyn where I was in class with him as a 12-year-old. And the Latin words were extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside the church, there's no salvation. And I went up to him after class, even as a 12-year-old, and I said, Father Berrigan, does that mean that my best friend Jerry Epstein can't go to heaven? And he said, John, if you don't baptize him, he won't go to heaven. So there is this notion of the chosen. It's not just the Jewish people that see themselves as chosen, and they wrestle with it. The great Jonathan Sachs said, we're chosen for special duty, not chosen as better than anybody. But Catholicism and other religions that say they have the truth, capital T, wrestle with that. So this, is the analogy. We fight crusades. At least in baseball, we don't kill people over it, at least not yet.
And I think there's a kind of different metaphor. I mean, this is about sports in general, of course, but there are particularities to different sports. And I think baseball has a system of language and metaphor that does offer a different kind of description of the struggle than, say, football, where the metaphor is war and battle. And you get a ton of that kind of language. It is more destructive and is more violent in that sense.
Listen, there's a way in which my book is an argument against exceptionalism and triumphalism. So it took me a lot of intellectual struggle with Tom and Peter, Tom Oliphant, of course, from Boston, and Peter Schwartz, who was a student in the first class. And they didn't get at first why I was so insistent on the title being Baseball as a Road to God, not the road to God. So I'm not going to make a triumphalist argument. I'll only talk phenomenologically about the qualities I see in baseball.
Yeah.
And one of the qualities that is relevant to what you just said, comparing it to football, is that for those who take it seriously, and of course this is true in religion too, there are people who are only inside a church for their own baptism, their own first communion, the last rites, and maybe the wedding. Those are the 4 times in their life, right? They're never seen in church again. So I'm not talking about, but those of us that really get into it in a way that people really get into the martial sport of football, just using one other example, by contrast, it digs into our inner selves, call it our souls if you want, because it's so opaque at the first level to the casual fan,
right,
that much of the action is going on, for example, between pitches.
Yeah, I love that.
For the true fan, if you're not an aggressive noticer that notices where the players are positioned, or that notices where the wind is blowing, or how tall the grass in the infield is, or all of those minutiae that people associate with baseball being boredom, that then you're not getting it. It's like a yoga almost. It's like a meditative, contemplative life. It's almost like becoming a monk.
It is the contemplative sport, and attention is so important to it. And I think this is the moment then where I want to kind of go into baseball is the philosophical sport. It's the spiritual sport. And then of course you can always, any individual athlete can bring those dimensions to their game. But baseball is kind of built in this interesting way. And the way that it's structured allows for that. And honestly, there's just so much that we could get into here, but I want to focus on attention and contemplation and time. And I think this is maybe a starting point, because so many people who don't understand baseball, who hate baseball, one of the first, you just said it, one of the first things they go to is boredom. In the sense, it's such a boring sport. And look at how the major leagues recently caved, added the pitching clock, tried to speed up the game. And there can be virtues to that. It's more exciting. It's going to keep the game more interesting to new people and kind of keep the sport going for a longer, perhaps. But it's worth appreciating all of that time between pitches and the fact that there is no clock, that it could potentially go on forever. I'm thinking of this 30 for 30 podcast episode about the longest game in history. It's a minor league game between Pawtucket and Rochester. And Cal Ripken and Wade Boggs are both in this game. The game ends up, spoiler alert, games end up going 33 innings due to a very strange rule that they couldn't call the game at midnight. And then they had to stop the game at 6 a.m. when the sun came up the next day on Easter morning. And they had to pick up the game months later to finish it. And the game ended 2-1 with Pawtucket winning out. And that's there's so much just in that the kind of attention demands that baseball makes on a player and on a fan is really fascinating.
Well, yes. And if this were a Supreme Court case and you were writing the majority opinion the way you wrote it, I would write not a dissenting opinion, but a concurring opinion. And I would want to differentiate from some of the things you said in ways that were important enough that I would take some words and write a concurring opinion.
Please do.
And specifically, I want to make clear that it's my view, at least, that baseball, even with the new rules, maintains its timeless quality. The 33-inning game could still occur with the present rules. As to the clock, I think that the clock rules, it seems to me, don't in any way diminish the contemplative aspect and the action between the pitches and so forth. They actually cut out what might have been kind of distractive stuff, like the habits that players got into with their gloves and batting and so forth and so on. So, I mean, people can disagree about the new rules. I happen to support the two I've mentioned, but I don't think they in any way undermine the contemplative nature of the sport.
I agree. And like I said, I find utility in it. I think that it's important utility for the overall sustainability and plausibility of baseball.
You get people into church with the music at first, but before you know it, they're taking the Eucharist.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. But I want to talk about that timeless quality apart from contemporary rule shifts. The timeless quality is amazing. I mean, you make the point in the book, I had never thought about this before, that, you know, the decision, for instance, to run counterclockwise, right? Like, what a beautiful metaphor for what baseball can do. And so I want to kind of get you waxing a little bit about, you know, going against the clock. There is this distinction, a Greek distinction. It's often used in theological circles, the difference between chronos time and kairos time. And baseball being more of the latter, kairos time, kind of the fullness of a moment, as opposed to the incremental moment by moment ticking of a clock. And I think the absence of the overall game clock and the capacity for the game to go forever, to be an infinite game, to borrow from James Carson, infinite games, there's a beauty to that. There is a space to occupy, even if it's just finding eternity in a moment, that being on a baseball field or being in a stadium, being at a little league field, playing catch, just does to somebody. And there's that timeless quality. I really would love to hear more from you on what draws you to that.
Right. So, well, first of all, a tip of my Yankee hat and the invisible, this gets us to another subject, Brooklyn Dodger hat that emanates around it. But with a tip of that in the direction of Bart Giamatti, he's written beautifully about this.
Yes.
And if one wanted to penetrate the subject we're talking about by reading one novel, which I love to do with my students in the course based on the book, and my own book, the one novel, of course, is the Iowa Baseball Confederacy.
Right, Kinsella. Yeah,
where Kinsella, you know, out there in Iowa, goes to a spot outside of the town, and at the railroad track slips through a time warp and ends up in a game that, of course, is played for 40 days and 40 nights and is quite apocalyptic. And it has all of these elements that you're talking about packed in it. Now, how do we make that meaningful to folks if they don't have time to read some of those works? At this point you make about Chronos and Kairos time, it's known to anyone who thinks about religion seriously, and even to those who simply are in a religious context occasionally, because it can be summarized in one word, and that is the word liturgy.
Yes.
You're moving into liturgical time, you know, and with liturgical time comes a whole set of experiences that are characterized by difference. So this, another way of saying Chronos and Kairos is to say ordinary and extraordinary, or as Mircea Eliade says, profane and sacred. And all you have to do is think of the high holy days, or if you think about Easter, that's special time, and that's preceded by something called Lent, which is a period of 40 days of beginning to prepare for Good Friday and Easter Sunday. So this notion that there's special time and time we treat differently. You know, Sandy Koufax, the greatest pitcher in the history of baseball, in my view, refused to pitch in the World Series on Yom Kippur. And later, in a kind of refrain on that, Sean Green of the Dodgers refused to play on Yom Kippur, even though in the heat of a pennant race. And he was arguably at that point the key position player on the Dodgers. So we are familiar with the notion when we think about religion of special times. What's interesting is the echoes of that in baseball. You'll frequently hear, especially because we have a pennant race going on right now with the new playoff format and everything, but sometimes you'll hear a broadcaster refer to the atmosphere at a regular season game as being almost like playoff baseball. Well, that's a way of saying, when we get to playoff baseball, everything moves from black and white to technicolor. Everything moves. There's a greater intensity to it. That, of course, is a quality of sacred time, of kairos time, that there's an intensity to it. Now, where does that intensity come from? Because you're noticing, your biology is noticing things that you wouldn't ordinarily notice, especially in the blistering pace of modernity, with the hyper-stimulated environment in which most of us live our ordinary lives. But then we move to that special time, Shabbat, or the high holy days, and, it's sacrilege to be doing the deal on Shabbat. Now, when you get into the real inner self of the true baseball fan, it's even more profound in my view, because with baseball, you withdraw into this game for, let's say 2 or 3 hours.
Yep.
And if you're watching it intensely, so if you're the fan that's actually there for the game, and for that 3 hours, you're actually in the game, then you are in this kind of sacred time. And what you're doing is, and it's like a muscle that you have to flex.
Yeah, absolutely.
Size, okay? It doesn't happen to you the first time. My granddaughters love to go to games with me because they say, Grandpa, we learn so much when we go to a game with you, because I'm constantly talking to them. Do you think the runner will go or not go? Do you think the next pitch will be a curve or a fastball?
Yeah.
Do you think, look at where the fielders are. That tells you something about what is going on in the game, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So your noticing muscle is being developed.
Yeah.
And the more you develop it in that time, okay, but you have to set the time as apart as special. Now we come out, there's a larger message here, which is, what is your noticing muscle is not necessarily my noticing muscle. We may not set apart the same thing as being sacred. These choices, which are parallel in baseball and in religion, are more out of descendancy than they are out of some volitional choice by the person who becomes the fanatic or the fanatic. Okay, that's what fans are.
Yeah.
They are adherents to a religion. And the reason that you're wearing a Red Sox hat and I'm wearing a Yankee hat go to where we were born, to whom we were born, the environment in which we were born, and whatever. They don't come to some truth, although they have tremendous power on us. Same it is with whether you think that Muhammad's truth is the truth, or Jesus' truth is the truth, or Abraham's truth is the truth. And, maybe we should just learn from that this notion of triumphalism, which then gets translated into power politics and war, is more contingent than we realize.
I'm with you. And that noticing muscle, it does both the work of drawing us back into the contemplative side of things, as well as the skill side of things, of cultivating a particular habit. So I did want to kind of take a moment to just address one thing and kind of ask you about, in the book, you definitely go toward saints and sinners, blessings and curses, but there's a little bit of, and I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts were on this, but when it comes to virtue formation or ethics and just the proliferation of rules that you get in baseball, you turn to the rule book as a kind of Bible, right? There are moments when the umpires will break out the holy text and consult the great rule book and decide, right? And this is one aspect that I find to be, especially at the level of coaching, So I coach young kids. I'm a coach pitch coach. My son, Ben, is now entering he's been in junior majors and now is kid pitch. But those young kids have an opportunity to cultivate real skill of attention, real skill of character and perseverance. And so I just wanted to ask, this is part and parcel, right? When you look at the history of religion, the cultivation of virtue and the moral codes that come alongside it, there is yet another opportunity to find analogy to baseball.
I agree completely. And I would say that baseball is particularly suited for building notions of, there's a word for a play in baseball called sacrifice.
Right. Sacrifice fly.
Right. There's the useful out.
Yes, productive outs, totally.
So this notion, which, by the way, the companion book to my book, Baseball is a Road to God, is a book that I wrote 5 years later called Standing for Reasons. And in a way, they combine my view of things. And there is, and I make this point more directly in Standing for Reason, there's been a 30 to 40 year effort at undermining the faith of Americans in our institutions, starting with the government, then with our churches, then with business, now with universities, even beyond that with courts and elections. This is an effort to undermine the faith in our institutions and a concomitant effort to undermine any notion of a common weal, and beyond that, a notion of sacrifice for the common weal. Actually, enduring pain in a cause that you will not get credit for actuating, because it takes, not just quarter to quarter or year to year or term to term, but it actually takes decades for the seeds to grow. And by the time they're grown, people may not even remember your name. I began about 15 years ago asking young people, first at NYU, then generally, in all kinds of audiences, have you ever heard of the book Profiles in Courage? Less than 10% will have heard of the book. So the whole notion of a profile in courage, of I look down into my open grave, of I sacrifice for the common weal, all of this is being eroded. Now, how does that relate to baseball? Well, when you're coaching baseball and notions of sacrifice or the productive out or the notion of a team, and then if you can get deep into it, I mean, we are in a badge society. So, I neither favor giving every participant a badge, because one of the things you learn is how to deal with disappointment, how to be resilient, how to fail. So in baseball, how does this start? There's a common, there's a team. Not everybody succeeds. The best hitter in baseball failed 6 times out of 10. Think about that. Now, the best hitter in baseball is down to failing 7 times out of 10. And what is a good closer? A good closer can forget the defeat of yesterday and learn from it and build on it. So resiliency, okay? And it's not, and I say this as a Yankee fan, when we're dealing with the at the level you're dealing with the coaching, it's about how we play the game virtuously and play it to the best of our ability. It's about personal best, not whether we end up in Williamsport winning the championship. Yes, it's a disappointment when you get there. It's not, it is not condemnation if you don't get there. And all of this stuff comes at a time when it's most needed in our society.
It really does. Yep. I work with a lot of kids who that time on the baseball field ends up being maybe like some of the most positive attention that they receive, maybe that day, perhaps that week. And it's an opportunity to be truly on a level playing field with friends. And in our league, there's a ton of diversity. It is one of those struggling little leagues where we're not sending a team to states and we're not winning our district these days. However, 1974, I believe, Walter Pop Smith Little League of New Haven sent an all African American team to Williamsport, and they lost to Taiwan in the semis. You know, like there's a history there.
Well, see, that's the nice. But now let me add another dimension to this notion of how time works here. So you know, Eliot's book that I use most directly is his book Sacred and Profane, which is on this ordinary, extraordinary dichotomy we talked about. But when he elaborates his ideas, he writes a book called Cosmos and History: The Myth of Eternal Return. So that's a quality in many dimensions that comes with baseball as well. Baseball, you know, Doris Kearns Goodwin in her terrific book, Wait Till Next Year, talks about how she became a historian by virtue of, as a young girl, doing the box score of the game so that when her dad got home from work, she could narrate the game to him. And that was her introduction to, in a way, historical research and presentation. Okay. Now, my dad was an alcoholic and a gambler, and he died when I was 16. And many of my virtues I attribute to the fact that he was also my hero. He was never abusive. I think that's critical. My mother never said a bad word about him, even in the 20 years she lived after his death, and certainly never during his life. He was our hero. So what do you learn? You learn human beings are not perfect. You learn forgiveness. You learn a belief in rehabilitation.
You learn try again.
And you learn resiliency, personal resiliency from it. Okay. So but part of my memory bank with my father is every single morning going over the box scores of the baseball games. Before I went to serve 6:30 Mass, before I went out on my paper route, there was 5 to 5:30 with my dad, who would have gotten up, even at times when he couldn't move, and gone to the candy store and gotten the Daily News and brought home the box scores and had them spread out while I had a little breakfast to go over them with me. And all that was involved with that, because in those days, fathers, it was, you know, fathers and sons weren't as communicative. Parents in general weren't as communicative. So this was our communicative device, and we bonded. And he always, the name he had for me was Pal. And he was Pal to me. He wasn't dad. I wasn't son. It was Pal. And that paldom developed in and around base. So there is this quality of the eternal return, which of course is very evocative of religion, which, you know, it's what the High Holy Days are about. It's what Easter's about. We live liturgically in a cyclical time, the way baseball lives liturgically. Opening day to the World Series, you know.
And also the All-Star break, you know, like think about like the midseason All-Star break, or the, you know, as you point out, the 7th inning stretch, right?
Yeah.
That like there is the cycle of it is important.
Some of them are memories that come out of that secularity that go back, you know, what would Koufax be like? What would Gibson be like if they pitched today?
Right.
Okay. But some of them go back to extremely specific personal memories, like those of Doris with her father, or me with my father, or you with your son at Little League and whatever.
And with my father, but also my mother, when, you know, she would put on the glove too and play catch with me.
And that's the scene at the end of Field of Dreams.
Yeah. I was just going to go, because we have to get to Kinsella's Field of Dreams as well. Where were you going to take it?
It's just that, Dad, can we play catch?
Right. And that is eternal return. And I just want to point out, like, the category we're getting into here is the capacity for that it's the call and response. It's not just an echo that goes off into the distance. It's a back and forth. It's a communication.
And it brings that time here.
Yeah, totally.
So the Eucharist is the Last Supper.
Yes. And it is also another eternal return. It's every time it's celebrated. That's right. Yeah, it's a fascinating, again, like it's just vibrant with rich metaphors, which is why like really good baseball writing is so profound. And that's the case with Kinsella. I mean, do you know a better baseball writer?
And it's one of the rare books where I think the movie is better than the book.
And I wanted to ask you about a few words that you use. You point out hierophany, which is, I believe, the kind of like a sort of sacred instance, like a kind of manifestation of the sacred in otherwise normal, mundane life. But you also talk about ineffability and the inability to express certain things in words, that it's a sort of like experiential requirement in order to come to some sort of knowledge of it. I want to add another word that you don't, I mean, like you use, it's an important word. We've already been there a little bit, but I wanted to add nostalgia. And of course, we've discussed time already. But nostalgia, this homesickness, this painful longing for home, which you can see how that works in baseball, of course, getting to home plate. I would like to stick on some of Field of Dreams and talk about ineffable, hierophany, and nostalgia. But what do those words mean to you?
Yeah. So the two key words in baseball as a road to God are hierophany and ineffable. So, Evan, you've gone up in my estimation simply by focusing in on that. Both of them are important to the core serious argument of the book, which is, as I said earlier, an argument against religious triumphalism. And they also are part of a lifelong intellectual struggle or project that I've had around the question of how important, how essential to religion is doctrine, which of course is intellectualization. And so one could use the words hierophany and ineffable, let's put aside nostalgia for the moment, as an antipode to doctrine. And certainly going a step beyond that along a spectrum as an antipode towards hierarchy and the concentration of the power of religious pronunciation, which of course, what do you pronounce but doctrine? So to the extent you move in a spectrum in the direction of words like hierophany and ineffable, you're moving away from I have the way of saying this. And the way to say it is transubstantiation, not transsignification. And we will kill you if you say transsignification and intellectualize the experience of the Eucharist that way, as opposed to the transubstantiation Aristotelian Thomistic way. Mm-hmm. So the first word we get to is ineffable. Abraham Heschel says that there is the known. Okay, so the known, that's what's taught at places like Amherst and Williams and Swarthmore and Haverford. You don't expect the people in the classroom to be creating the next generation of ideas, but you expect them to be up on everything that's known and use that to teach critical thinking and the canon of what is known. Then the next thing Heschel says is the knowable but not yet known. And that's the task of the research university, okay, is to discover and push the boundaries of what we can conceptualize, what we can put into the words. And then there is the ineffable. And the ineffable is that which just fundamentally can't be put into words. So we sometimes have words that signify the ineffable. One such word is love. So I did not persuade Lisa to love me or that I loved her. It was a deeply known fact. It was the driver of our lives and remains that 17 years after her death. But it is not something I can conceptualize. And I can't convince you that you love me. I can't convince you of a certain religious moment in my life being the moment that you should be sharing if you can't share it. And that then brings us to hierophany. And hierophany in the Greek is hieros, the sacred, phanos, shining through. So it is whatever in this world causes you to be drawn to the sacred experience. And it's highly contingent. So the example I use first with my students is I put on a picture of Uluru, okay, because the native Australian is the longest continuous civilization in the world. There are cave paintings in Australia that I've seen that are beyond carbon dating. They go back 100,000 years. And Uluru, which the British call Ayers Rock, Uluru is that mound. You've seen it. I'm sure your listeners have seen it. It's this huge, I would say about 15-story high, if you want to do it in a Manhattan apartment building, mound in the middle of the outback, which is utterly flat for as far as you could see in a plane flying for an hour in any direction. Okay. Suddenly there is this, which to the native Australian is Axis Mundi. It's the place where the connection between the sacred and the gods and all that's there connects to this mundane world. Okay. So it is for them a hierophany. As I look at it, I'm seeing a beautiful geological wonder. And I can understand why it would be evocative, but I don't experience the evocation that my native Australian guy does. Meanwhile, if I decide to take out the host and the chalice, to me, the Eucharist connects me experientially with the sacred and the Last Supper and with Christ and all that means. And for him, we're eating lunch. So this is the contingency of the religious experience that is ineffable. So that's where the word liturgy comes in. So to me, it's the liturgical, not the doctrinal or the hierarchical or structural, that becomes the essence of the religious experience. Okay, that's the approach through Eliot and Otto and such writers that I take to analyze baseball as a religion. And it leads you immediately to nostalgia, which is the third word you introduce, because that is the yearning. Eliot calls it now here, the word myth, we have to pause for a moment, because in this context, the word myth is a very affirmative, positive word. Myth is what captures this liturgical moment, okay? Because we tell stories. We don't tell them for the facts. We tell them to try to express the experience. Eliot has this great example where he's with a village where the annual festival each year involves a couple that was about to be married. And on the night before their wedding, the groom was thrown from a cliff into a ravine and died. And Eliot got there to study it, and the woman was still alive. And she told him, oh, the guy was coming home along the path on the mountain and was drunk as a skunk, and he fell off the mountain and died. And when Eliot went to the townspeople and said, well, here are the facts, they said, oh, she's an old woman. She just doesn't remember the truth. Because they had internalized the myth and the story of the tragedy, the deep tragedy that had befallen this young couple. So nostalgia is an important part of that. And it operates on two dimensions, as we said before. It operates by bringing you back to the archetypal period, bring the eternal return to that, you know. And of course, that is always aspirational. It's where we hope to be, which brings in, you know, the aggressive virtue of hope, not the soft, it's only a hope virtue of hope, But we really hope to be. We really believe we can be. It's again something that we're missing in society now. But sometimes it also brings us back to some very specific memories. It's the myth of eternal return. And that brings us back to that place which is deep in memory and to which we yearn to go because it was a place of love.
Yeah, because there's I think it's maybe about the experience of baseball. And it's represented, of course, in the striving for home plate, but it's also represented in the extremely long season, the arduous 162 games. It's, the infinite qualities or the potentially infinite qualities of it. And then I think it's great to be landing on hope because it is that kind of hope against hope.
The hope that comes with preseason.
And the hope of a fan to a team that doesn't have much of a chance, that is somehow still believing, right? Somehow still.
My son remembers as an 11-year-old after a Yankee defeat, sitting with me in a restaurant called the Brasserie in a booth at about 11 o'clock at night, where we took out the remaining 20 games that the Yankees had to play. And we won each game. It said, whether you would think they'll win this game. And we ended up with them going 18-2, which would have just gotten them into the playoffs by the skin of their teeth. Everybody knows they're not going 18-2. But we didn't know that in that moment. We had that.
And was it possible? Yes.
By the way, this is fun.
It's very fun.
You're not as vile as I thought.
Thank you. Did you play Little League?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I'm a historic figure in Little League. I am the Jackie Robinson of the B'nai B'rith Little League. I was the first boy. I and Billy Ryan, we went in together. It was like Robinson and Newcomb. And we were the first going to play in the B'nai B'rith Little League.
Really? That's amazing. And that was in Brooklyn?
That was in Brooklyn, yeah.
Do you have Little League memories?
I was a catcher. And a very good catcher with a very accurate throwing arm, which is unusual in Little League baseball. But even though I was a good hitter when we played around the neighborhood, I became a specialist, kind of foreshadowing Ron Hunt of the Mets and Anthony Rizzo of the Yankees as being hit by pitches. And so if the statistic, the on-base percentage had been created, I would have really been a superstar because I would manage to get hit by a pitch about every other time.
Well, and Moneyball taught us that on-base percentage is really important. So
I understand, but I was ahead of my time.
You sure were.
It's all about timing. Although they did, I think, because I was one of the two Catholic kids, both of us were named to the All-Star team.
Really?
And I got to go to a baseball game as part of it. But I was not good enough to play in high school. I yearned at playing in high school, but I couldn't have I became, therefore, a debater, which produced one of my great memories and a friendship, because I was on the third floor of my high school, a good 40 feet off the ground, about 325 feet from home plate, when a baseball came through the window that was hit by a senior from St. Francis Prep by the name of Joe Torrey.
No way.
That led to a lifelong friendship.
That's incredible. I played catcher a bit. I played first base, center field, and I could hit the ball, but also did not make my high school team. And I remember feeling conflicted that I had played so much baseball to that point that, other interests, particularly music and surfing, growing up in San Diego, I had kind of lost a little bit of my first love for baseball, but there was still the pain of not making the high school team and the yearning that was there. And it was like, I guess that's the end of that. And eternal return, the blessing of that, it wasn't the end, of course, but I gave up on baseball at that point for many years, really only to truly come back to it when my kids got into it. And it was the idea of this passing along and playing catch with them and just developing a love and the stories, kind of just living in the stories of it. But Little League is such a formative and beautiful expression of the sport.
In writing the book, Baseball is a Road to God, I chose the most difficult form of baseball for my argument by choosing professional baseball
Sure.
as opposed to the purity of Little League, or at least near purity. There are parents that act out, but the near purity of Little League baseball and minor league baseball.
Sure. But I mean, if you take the coaches and the parents out of Little League, everyone's having a great time.
Right. That's right. That's exactly right.
What about your earliest, maybe favorite baseball memory?
Well, my father was, for a while, the political boss of Brooklyn. My grandfather had been the political boss of Brooklyn. And the result was that I met Jackie and Rachel Robinson when I was 10 and 11 and 2. And we had a house at the beach. And the black ball players were by and large not welcome at other officials' houses at the beach. But my dad and mom welcomed Robinson and Newcomb and Campanella. We had tickets every Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and night game. The night games were rare. So I could go to games, and then we had tickets about 40 seats up from the third base coach's box. And the memories of being there with my dad and then going in with friends, like on a Saturday afternoon and taking the bus and subway in and then spending the day at the ballpark. So my two great heroes, other than obviously family, but my two great celebrity heroes in my life were Jackie Robinson and Pete Seeger, both of whom I was blessed with getting to know at a fairly young age. Let's focus here on Jackie. On my academic gown, I have the number 42. And I was lucky enough to get to meet him and to meet the wonderful Rachel, who has a PhD, not an honorary doctorate. She has a PhD in nursing from NYU and is still alive at the age of 102. I saw her just a month ago. So Jackie Robinson and the Dodgers were at a very deep level present for me. And when I think of baseball, I think first of them. I do not recognize the Los Angeles Dodgers. They are schismatic. And the Dodgers, as Johnny Padre said, will win the World Series only once. And that was October the 4th, 1955. So the Dodgers are part of the religion of baseball for me. And it was a very intentional decision when my son was born in 1969, which was the Mets' miracle year. And the Dodgers were in the West Coast, and there was no such thing as DirecTV, and the games were late anyway. So being a Dodger fan or giving him Dodger fandom was not feasible. And I realized that giving him the teams for which he would root, this was even before I began thinking of the book or the course or anything else. But I intuited that giving him the teams for which he rooted was a more important benefaction than giving him. So he was baptized, but later bar mitzvahed.
Oh, interesting.
But he's still a Yankee fan, and I chose the Yankees. Now, I don't know if I could have chosen the Yankees if they were still at the top of the pile. In 1969, they were awful. I mean, the highlight of the season was their shortstop, a man by the name of Gene Michael, who later built the great teams in the 90s, perpetrating twice in one season the hidden ball trick, which I had only seen done until recently in Little League, but never in the major leagues. Michael did it twice in one season. And the Mets were having this miracle year. The 50s Catholic in me chose to give my son the monuments and the hagiography of Ruth and Garrick and, and a tradition with a capital T, which is very important to Catholics. So, and then I continued to root for the Koufax, Drysdale, Sutton teams. But when they played the Yankees in the 70s, I couldn't bring myself to root against my son's team. So I converted.
I've just got a few more here. I wonder if you could just give me a tiny bit more on the significance of Jackie Robinson just at the racial level. Baseball has, along with the rest of America and the rest of Christianity, I'd say, a very sordid and sadly compromised history with respect to race.
Yeah. So just last night in class, there was a class on the First Amendment religion clauses. And the first important case in that area was decided in 1947. And I looked at this class of young people. I said, now, why is 1947 one of the most important years in the history of the world? And they looked at me with puzzlement. And I said, because that's the year Jackie Robinson broke the color line in baseball. And that was a huge foreshadowing. Pete Hamill, by the way, wrote a great novel called Snow in August that triangulates a young Irish boy who was obviously Pete as a 12 or 13-year-old with a rabbi who's just arrived from Prague and Jackie Robinson. And it's a wonderful sense of what the world then was like. And Pete would say that Jackie Robinson made it possible for Martin Luther King to happen. That's how important breaking the color line in baseball was, because this is right after World War II, and you had phenomena like the Tuskegee Airmen, the majority of whom I should say were NYU people, and you had a tremendous integrative force. When these people become your friends and you're in combat with them in the infantry or the Navy or whatever, there was an integrative force that wasn't sufficient to create a widespread awareness in the Ozzie and Harriet, Dwight Eisenhower 50s of the injustices that had been done. But it created a bridge of friendship that was a predicate for when those injustices were pointed out, making the recognition of the injustices greater. But Jackie Robinson and baseball were important elements of that, because Jackie and Newcomb and Campanella, I mean, there was a time in 1955 when the starting lineup of the Dodgers was majority black, that 5 of the 9 players were black, because by then Emeritus had come up and so on. There was a self-evident in a core area of the civil religion of America, which, you remember, baseball was really, football hadn't become a thing yet, basketball hadn't become a thing yet, hockey certainly hadn't become a thing yet, but people united around baseball, as the unique sport. It was America's game. And the self-evident preclusion that had happened, all that talent that was out there, and then Page coming back, of course, in his 40s, late 40s, and still getting out the best white hitters that there were out there. I mean, there was no denying it. It was like the Jesse Owens moment in the Hitler Olympics. So there was a power that came with Jackie. And, of course, critical is the virtue and grace with which he handled it. We talked in a different context about the lack of awareness in our society generally, even among brilliant students that I teach who are going to be leaders, of what profiles in courage means, what suffering pain in a cause means. Well, Jackie was the personification of that. And I mean, his willingness to subdue the rage that he had, and then the gradual, Pee Wee Reese putting the arm over the shoulder, Pee Wee Reese from Louisville, Kentucky, putting his arm over the shoulder of his teammate, the second baseman and the shortstop. These were iconic moments that were more catalytic, I think, of the racial justice movement than has generally been appreciated.
Because it occurred on a baseball field, and because you're entering almost into this, not just a different kind of sequence of time or a different expression of time, but sort of this alternate dimension.
It's occurring in the sanctum sanctorum. It's occurring in the most sacred of places.
So, I mean, I just want to, you had something like a relationship with Jackie Robinson.
It was the kind of relationship that when we reconnected, especially when I reconnected with Rachel, because Jackie was gone, and here I was, the dean and then the president of NYU, And one of the first things I did was give Rachel an honorary degree. And then, because I have a liturgical sense, and I'm very proud that NYU is the only university that has its graduation in Yankee Stadium.
I did not know that.
The president confers the honorary degrees essentially at second base. And it occurred to me in my last year as president that the greatest relief pitcher of all time, but also the last person to wear the number 42, had just retired. So when at the 50th anniversary of Jackie's breaking in 1997, as you know, baseball retired the number 42 in all of baseball. So nobody will ever wear the number 42 again, except liturgically on every April 15th, which is April 14th, 1947, is the day that Jackie broke into baseball. And every year on April 15th, everybody in baseball wears the number 42 in his honor. But when that happened in 1997, when they retired the number, there were 3 players that had the number 42 that were grandfathered in, and 2 of them were journeymen. Third, thankfully, who outlasted the other 2, was the greatest relief pitcher in the history of baseball, Mariano Rivera.
Yeah.
So
that's fitting.
So in my last year as president, on second base at Yankee Stadium, we conferred an honorary degree on Mariano, but the hooding was done by Rachel. So that gives you a kind of liturgical, because if you think about it, what is graduation but a sacrament? Right? It is a hierophanic moment. It's creating memories for the students, and how do you do that? Some years you have Taylor Swift come and speak, and some years you have Mariano Rivera hooded by Rachel Robbins.
Yeah. I like that also that you're conferred the degree at second base, not home plate, right? You're only ever on the way. You might be in scoring position, but you're not you're not done. You're not done at all.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
At the level of baseball and the role it plays in a life worth living, I want to ask you both personally and then with respect to baseball, what is a life worth living?
So this is going to go in a direction I don't think you're aware it will go. For my 80th birthday, 2 years ago, the Klan convened and we went into the Grand Canyon for 19 days. And I came out of the Grand Canyon, and because a year and a half earlier, I had gone through getting a rare cancer, which is eye cancer, which had been, everybody thought, treated well. But consequently, I had to have MRIs every quarter to see if it had spread, because it's a very aggressive cancer. And I came out of the Grand Canyon, went for one of these MRIs, and was told that I had stage 4 liver and brain cancer, 30 tumors, and that I had 4 to 6 months to live. And it was a moment where the doctors attempted to begin helping me through this difficult period, and after an hour, they realized how eccentric the being was with which they were dealing, because I said to them, really, this is wonderful. And they said, well, isn't there a relationship you want to repair or announce? No. I said, I've lived this unbelievably blessed and open life. And, I just, there's nothing. Now, I did, after they press, say, is it okay if for the next 4 months I end each day eating a pint of ice cream? And they said, of course, yes. And as a result, I gained 40 pounds. I call it the dying period. I now can do an hour and a half stand-up comedy on it. It was glorious. It was absolutely wonderful. It was Technicolor, and it was, intense, and all the friends you care about, but you just assume you're going to see them, make a point of coming to see you, it was just absolutely one of the one granddaughter who was not in the city moved in as my roommate down the hall and transferred colleges to NYU. And my daughter moved back from the West Coast. I mean, it was all just wonderful, And then a few days ago, a friend asked me how I was feeling, because it's obviously 2 years later.
Yeah, you're not dead yet.
And I said, I'm feeling mortified. And then I realized the Latin root of the word mortified. And I said, well, I was due for mortification, but I didn't mortify in a timely way. And now I'm kind of embarrassed. And one of my friends, the former school chancellor, Joel Klein, we were out to the theater about a year ago when it was clear I had died. And the doctors were just baffled. They can't figure out why. I mean, the 30 tumors are alive, and they glower out at the MRIs I have every 2 months.
Wow.
And they haven't grown or shrunk in 2 years.
My goodness.
No, I would be on data.
Sure.
And Joel took me by the shoulders. He said, Sexton, I'm going to have the courage to tell you something none of your other friends are going to tell you. Once in your life, you get to tell your friends and family you got 4 to 6 months to live. You've used your once. If the doctors tell you again, don't mention it. Just die. We've all said everything. Interesting. One of my granddaughters, who's a film student, made a short. She had to make a short. And this is during the dying period. And she went back to a game we had made up out of a Kinsella short story. And the game was, and we would play it on the river in calm waters when you're just rowing or whatever. Suppose that part of the anatomy of evolution was that 6 months before you were going to die, your little toe fell off. So you knew you were on the clock. What, if anything, would you do differently during those 6 months? Okay, is there someone you would profess your love? Is there someone you'd repair your relationship? Is there a place you'd want to go? And then if there is something you would do differently, why are you waiting? Why would you wait till the last 6 months? Now, if you've lived your life to be as useful as you can be, right? That's what the Jesuits taught us, a life for others, a useful life, a life of joy, not happiness, right? Maybe you have happiness, but the key thing is joy in producing in others. So I made up this word possibilitarian to describe. And if you ask me what kind of life to lead, such that when you come to a moment where you're told you have 4 to 6 months to live, and you can accept it joyfully and just enjoy and say to the doctors, look, I'm not interested in longevity. Whatever treatment you want to give me, I do not want it to affect my ability to live the life I'm leading. So every Tuesday I go for my infusions and gene therapy, but it's not the kind of treatment that causes me to be ill. I'm a little more tired than usual. I can't go in the sun as much. But other than that, I'm teaching a full schedule and enjoying my children and grandchildren and about to head off on a polar bear safari. And, so I think the key is not waiting to those last 6 months and just using your talent. If you're blessed, as I said to my students last night, everyone in this room, even you, the Red Sox fan, not every human being is blessed with what we've been blessed with, but we were blessed by a gift. Call it a grace if you want, and that is we were born smart. So if you're blessed with that gift, and you're blessed with that gift in a place where it makes a difference. I mean, there are 40 million children in the world. They do a lot of work now with refugees and displaced kids. 40 million school-age kids in the world that won't meet a teacher for one day in their whole lives. Another 350 million can't get past the 4th grade, no matter how smart they are. So here we are at Yale and NYU, and we've been given that double gift, and we damn well better use it well. And if you live that kind of life, and there's a way in which baseball teaches you that, to bring it back to baseball, because you can have the gift. There are players, we know them, who had the gift, who just squandered it and never became what they could become. Maybe they became very good players, some of them. Some of them didn't make it. I mean, think of this, the tragedy of this gifted pitcher that the Yankees had, Herman, who just squandered his talent in a dark place. And that's just one example from the last 5 years on the team I root for. So get the things done that you would get done in that last 6 months.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. I'm delighted to have met you, John.
I'm delighted to have met you too. Yeah, you're good. I like you. I hope we can meet in person sometime.
I hope so too.
Maybe we'll go to a game. You want to go to a game together?
I'd go to a game.
Okay, so you just...
I have to tell you, I've never been to Yankee Stadium.
Okay, so hold on a second, because I don't bullshit, okay?
And he really doesn't. John did take me out to the ball game. And you can find a rare picture of a Yankee fan and a Red Sox fan just enjoying the game together in the show notes for today's episode. And thanks for listening today. But before wrapping this episode, I feel like I just need to offer a few shout outs. Baseball is important to me. And in doing this interview and episode at this phase of life, it just brought up so many memories, so many faces. And maybe you've got a baseball or a softball memory of your own to be grateful for. So to Oceanside American Little League in San Diego, where I grew up playing, and New Haven's Walter Pop Smith Little League, where I coach, and to Nick, who sat on the bench with me, and to Chris, who threw a fastball that ended up over the fence, even when he knew I couldn't hit a curve, to Mom for the rides and snacks and just constant support, to Dad for introducing the game and never saying no to playing catch, to Kyle for just being there and rooting for the Padres with me, and to Lainey, Nan, Lux, Ben, and Gus, my team, for backyard wiffle ball, stadium visits, hot dogs and sunflower seeds, and making baseball the perfect game. For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured John Sexton, production assistants by Alexa Rollo, Emily Brookfield, Casey Barrett, and Zoe Halliban. I'm Evan Rosa, and when I'm not editing or producing the show, I'm coaching Little League, obsessing over how to teach kids baseball and analyzing throwing and batting mechanics. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu or lifeworthliving.yale.edu, where you can find all sorts of resources to help people envision and pursue lives worthy of our humanity. If you're new to the show, remember to hit subscribe. And if you're a loyal supporter, a faithful listener, please consider telling a friend or sharing an episode. You could hit the share button for this episode and send it as a text or an email to a friend, or put it in your social feed. You could give us an honest rating and review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you could tell a friend in person. Thanks for listening today, friends. We'll be back with more soon.